All right, today we are diving into a really fascinating problem of biological plumbing, something called aortic coarctation. We're going to break down how doctors go about fixing a critical kink in what is essentially the body's most important pipeline.
So, just imagine this for a second. What if the main water pipe that leaves your city's pumping station had a massive squeeze in one spot? Well, the pressure before that squeeze would build up to dangerous levels, right? And everything downstream would be totally starved for flow. That, in a nutshell, is exactly what happens with aortic coarctation.
So the official medical term for this kink is aortic coarctation. It's a narrowing or stenosis of the aorta. And the aorta, well, it's the absolute superhighway for blood leaving your heart. This bottleneck means the heart, which is your body's incredible pump, has to go into serious overtime, just fighting against that resistance to get blood where it needs to go.
Okay, so for our first section, let's take a closer look at this kink in the pipeline. When does this plumbing problem get so bad that a doctor says, all right, it's time to fix this?
Well, doctors are on the lookout for a few key signs. First up, high blood pressure in the upper body, specifically the arms. That makes sense, right? All that pressure from the heart is building up right before the narrowing. Second, they measure the pressure difference between your arms and your legs. If it's more than 20 millimeters of mercury, that is a huge red flag that blood just isn't getting past that kink the way it should. And finally, they look for something called LV hypertrophy. Basically, the heart's main pumping chamber starts getting thicker, more muscular, because it's been working out way too hard for way too long. It's a classic sign of strain.
So, once everyone agrees it's time to intervene, doctors have a choice to make. And it's between two really different paths. For decades, there was only one way to do it. But now, they have to weigh the traditional surgical fix against some really cool, modern, catheter-based options.
And this timeline just perfectly shows how medicine evolves. For something like 60 years, open heart surgery was it. That was the gold standard. But then, about 30 years ago, this new idea started to take hold. Hey, what if we could fix the problem from the inside? And that's when these transcatheter techniques burst onto the scene, offering a much, much less invasive way forward. So let's really break down the difference here. Surgery is, well, it's direct. They open the chest, literally cut out the narrowed piece of the aorta, and then sew the healthy ends back together. The catheter approach, though, is a bit more elegant. It uses the body's own arteries, like highways, to guide tiny tools all the way to the problem and fix it from within. And as you can imagine, that means no huge incision and a recovery time that is way, way shorter. All right, let's get into the first of these catheter-based tools. It's an idea that is so simple, but wow, is it effective? We're talking about the balloon.
So here's how it works. A cardiologist threads a super thin tube, that's the catheter, through an artery, usually in the leg, and guides it all the way up to that narrow spot in the aorta. On the end of that catheter is a tiny deflated balloon. Once it's in the perfect position, right inside the kink, they inflate it with high pressure. This force literally stretches the artery wall and forces it open. Then, they just deflate the balloon and pull it out, leaving behind a much wider path for the blood to flow through. Simple as that.
Now this is where it gets really interesting, because how does that stretching actually work? It's not just a gentle expansion. The mechanism is actually a controlled tearing of the inner and middle layers of the artery wall. It's a forceful, deliberate injury that, as it heals, creates that wider opening. Kind of wild, right?
And that idea of controlled tearing brings us straight to the central trade-off. The huge plus, no permanent implant is left behind in your body. It's obviously way less traumatic than surgery, and you're out of the hospital much faster. But the downsides are tied directly to that tearing mechanism. The artery can kind of spring back and re-narrow over time, and even more seriously, you can damage the artery wall and create a weak spot, what's called an aneurysm.
And believe me, that risk of an aneurysm is not trivial. Studies have shown the rate can be anywhere from as low as 1% all the way up to 35%. That massive range really shines a light on the main drawback of just using a balloon, and it's a huge reason why doctors needed to develop another tool.
Which brings us right to our fourth section, and the second big fix, the stent. I want you to think of this as bringing in some internal scaffolding to support that newly widened artery.
The procedure actually starts the exact same way, with a catheter. But this time, there's a tiny collapsed metal mesh tube, that's the stent, that's fitted over the balloon. So when the balloon inflates, it's not just stretching the artery, it's also expanding the stent and pressing it firmly against the artery walls. Then the balloon is deflated and removed, but the stent stays behind, acting as a permanent scaffold to prop the artery open for good.
And this is the key to the whole thing. The stent provides physical, radial support. It physically stops that elastic recoil, the tendency of the stretched artery to just snap back to its old narrow shape. It basically solves one of the biggest headaches of the balloon-only method.
So the advantages here are pretty clear. You get much more predictable results, and the relief from the narrowing lasts. The risk of an aneurysm, it drops dramatically, which is huge. The main trade-off, though, is that you now have a permanent implant in your body. And, for a growing kid, that stent might need to be re-expanded down the road. But, while there are some other small risks like the stent fracturing, the overall mortality risk is incredibly low. We're talking less than 1%.
Now, it's not quite as simple as just using a stent, because not all stents are created equal. You've got your bare metal stent, which is exactly what it sounds like, a simple mesh scaffold. It's perfect for simple, clean narrowings, especially in younger patients with healthy arteries. But for more complicated problems, like a really long narrowing, or if there's already an aneurysm there, doctors will use a covered stent. This one has a fabric-like material over it that acts like a patch, sealing off any weak spots. It's often the go-to choice for older adults. And all of this brings us to our final section, the long-term view. Because, and this is so important, fixing the kink isn't always the end of the story.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical to understand that this is a lifelong condition. Even after a totally successful procedure, constant monitoring is key. You see that somewhere between 2 and 10% of patients will have the artery re-narrow, and up to 15% can develop an aneurysm over time. So while most patients do great and stay stable, this really shows why lifelong follow-up is non-negotiable.
This just really drives the point home that the treatment is just the beginning of a long journey. The fix isn't always final. That re-narrowing or recoarctation can definitely happen. And like we said, stents put in kids often need to be stretched out again as they grow. It just means having an ongoing, close relationship with a medical team is absolutely essential.
So, let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here. Aortic coarctation is a serious plumbing problem for sure, but it's one we can fix. The way we treat it has totally transformed, moving from big open surgeries to these slick catheter techniques. Remember the core difference. Balloons stretch the artery by that controlled tearing, while stents act as permanent scaffolding. Each one has its own unique pros and cons. And maybe most importantly, this is a lifelong condition. Vigilant monitoring, using modern tools like MRI and CT scans, is absolutely essential for long-term health.
Which kind of leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We've gone from cracking chests open to using tiny balloons and stents in just a few decades of medical history. So as these tools get even smarter, and as materials improve, maybe we'll even have reabsorbable stents that do their job and then just dissolve. Could we one day get to a point where we can fix this problem permanently with one single, minimally invasive procedure and never have to touch a scalpel again? It's a pretty exciting future to think about.